In the last video, we had a look at C1. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on F1, F2, F3, and F4. You can find the next two terms in a simple sequence. Before even starting a question of this type, let's have a look at our three key steps for this unit. Number one would be our sequence, number two is our arrows, and number three is our rule. So our sequence reads as follows: 10, 13, 16, 19, so on and so on. So we're asked to find the next two terms. First, we're going to jot down our arrows, and notice our arrows are in between each individual term. Then we're going to find our rule. So our rule here is that we are adding 3 each time. This is a linear type of sequence because we've got a common term-to-term rule. We are adding 3 in each case, and our term-to-term rule is not changing and it's staying the same. To find our first missing gap now, we need to first find what our previous term is. In this case, it's 19. So we need to do 19, add 3. So 19 add 3 would be 22. To find the second term, it would be the previous term, which was 22, that we just found together. So 22 add the 3, which is our term-to-term rule, would be 25. Then once we've found both these numbers, we can take a note of it. So the first gap would be 22 and the second gap would be 25. So remember, the 22 would be our 5th term and the 25 would be our 6th term. Have a go at this question and pause the video here. Okay, here's the solutions. Make sure that you self-assess your work before moving on. Now remember, in this sequence we are decreasing each time, so you should have got -5, so we are subtracting 5. And that's the end of F1, and we're now ready to move on to F2. I can find the next two terms of a sequence that does not have a common term-to-term rule. Before you even start this question, remember your 3 key steps: your sequence, your arrows, and then your rule. So our sequence is 10, 14, 19, 25, so on and so on. So the first thing you do is your arrows, remember, in between each individual term, and then we need to find our rule, again between each individual term. Now here you'll notice that we do not have a linear sequence, and the reason why is because we do not have a common term-to-term rule. We're adding 4, 5, 6, and would expect to add 7 and 8, so we can see that the term-to-term rule here is changing each time. Now, I've used the gap between 19 and 25, which was adding 6, to determine what the next rule would be, which is adding 7. So 25 add the 7 gives us 32, and to find the next term we need to add 8, so we need to do 32 add the 8, which gives us 40. And would expect, if we kept going, to be adding 9, adding 10, and so on. So we jot these two down. So the first missing term would be 32 and the second missing term would be 40. So we can see in our sequence the 5th term is 32 and the 6th term is 40. Here's a question for you to try. Pause the video here. Okay, here's the solutions. Make sure that you self-assess your work before moving on. So we can see that we were subtracting 4, 6, 8, 10, and 12, and so on each time. And notice that we are subtracting 2 from the previous term-to-term rule. And that's the end of F2, and we are now ready to move on to F3. I can find the next two terms of a simple decimal sequence. Now remember your 3 steps: sequence, arrows, and rule. So we've got 1.0, 1.2, 1.4, 1.6, so on and so on. So first thing you need to do is you need to do your arrows in between each individual term, and then you need to find your rule again in between each individual term. So we can see that our rule is that we are adding 0.2 each time. The easiest way to double check this is that you could have used the column method to find the gap in between 1.0 and 1.2. So you should have got 0.2 as your final answer. Now to find the first missing term, we would need to do 1.6, which was our previous term, add the 0.2, which gives us 1.8. And again, you can use the column method to double check the answer as well. Now to find our second missing term, we need to do 1.8 add the 0.2. Now there are two possible answers that you could have got. Is it 2 or is it 2.0? Now the answer is 2.0, and the reason why it's 2.0 is because if you look back at our sequence is to one decimal place. So if we remember this, we need to make sure that we write down all of our answers to one decimal place. So therefore our answer would be 2.0 and not 2. So 1.8 plus the 0.2 would be our 2.0. So once we've done that, we can jot this down. So the first missing term would be 1.8 and the second missing term would be 2.0. Here's a question for you to try. Pause the video here. Here's the solutions. Make sure that you self-assess your work. Particularly bear in mind that you should have got 0.6 as your term-to-term rule and not 0.06. It would have been 0.06 if you had 0.66 as your second term, but that is not the case. That's the end of F3, and we are now ready to move on to F4. I can find missing terms in a decimal sequence. So we've got a sequence 2.0, then we've got a gap, 2.6, 2.9, we've got another gap, and then 3.5. We are usually used to finding the next two terms, but in this sequence, you're asked to find two terms within our actual sequence. So the first thing we need to do is we need to draw our arrows for each individual term. Once we've done that, we then need to use two terms that are next to each other. In this case, we've got 2.6 and 2.9 next to each other, and we need to find the rule between those two terms. In this case, it will be plus 0.3 as we are adding 0.3. In this case, the 0.3 applies all the way throughout because this is a linear sequence. So we are then going to write the 0.3 all the way throughout. Once we've done that, we can then find our missing terms. So to find the first missing term, we're going to start from the previous term before the gap. So in this case, it will be 2.0, add the 0.3, which will give us the 2.3. Now, bear in mind, to find the next missing term, we're going to use 2.9 as our previous term, and then we're going to add 0.3, and then we're going to get 3.2. Once we've done that, we can jot down our answers. So the first missing term would be 2.3, and the second missing term would be 3.2. So here, 2.3 would be our second term, and 3.2 would be our fifth term. Here's a question for you to have a go at. Pause the video here. Here's the solutions. Make sure that you self-assess your work. So, as you can see, we got 4.80 as our first answer and 5.10 as our second answer, as our sequence is to two decimal places. So make sure that you've done that. That's the end of F4, and in today's lesson we successfully completed F1, F2, F3 and F4. So now we're going to have a look at a beat the clock. So we have a definition first, then we are asked to find the next four terms and to write the term-to-term rule. And in the final part, we are asked to find the missing gap and then to write down the term-to-term rule. Now, for this section, spend a maximum of 5 minutes and use the help of a timer to time yourself. Pause the video here. Here are the solutions. Make sure that you've self-assessed your work. Okay, so for the first question, if you got this correct, then you have mastered C1. A sequence is a set of numbers that follow a pattern or a rule. For the next question, you were asked to find the next four terms. So in both questions, make sure that you have found your four terms. Then you were asked to also write down the term-to-term rule, and in both cases, it is positive. So if you got these correct, then you have mastered an F1 and an F2 type of question. For the second part, you were asked to find the missing gaps and the term-to-term rule. If you got these two questions correct, then you would have mastered an F3 and an F4 type of question. Particularly if you got the last question correct, this is an example of how you could have demonstrated resilience, as it is a very difficult question. You were asked to find 3 gaps and you were not given enough information to find it. And that is going to be the end of today's lesson.